Thank you so much, Jeff. And now I want to welcome our first plenary session to the stage. The title of the session is All of the Abundance, and if that sounds clunky to you, you can blame me. That was a hopefully effective riff on all of the above and the abundance agenda. All of the above is this notion that we'll get into on this panel that has become, I think, something of an object of derision among many in the sort of climate and energy space over the last decade. And so that's what we wanted to talk about today, and I think we've got a bunch of good folks to do so. So please join me in welcoming the panel to the stage.
Hello, these lights are bright. Well, I hope everybody streaming can see us really well thanks to this, because otherwise we're just blind for no good reason. But go out. Thank you. It's intimidating to go first panel-wise, but this is a great conference, it's a great event. It was a lovely evening yesterday, great sort of inspiring tech talk to get us kicked off. So we're talking today, the pun for all of the abundance is the idea of an all of the above energy strategy, which I think is a policy idea that keeps having sort of ups and downs in the conventional wisdom. My read of the Obama administration is that very much contrary to their intentions, they wound up essentially pursuing an all of the above energy strategy. We had an incredible expansion of renewables and growth in batteries, electric vehicles under Obama, but also American domestic oil and gas production soared after decades of decline, and emissions fell quite a bit during Obama's term because, of course, natural gas has a lot of complementarities with renewables that environmentalists don't always like to talk about, but that are clearly there in the economics. Under Trump, you know, we had a very much a fossil fuel rhetoric, but the same progress on renewables continued, and I think the feeling in progressive circles was that all of the above was completely obsolete, and they came in with Biden, and we were going to completely do without fossil fuels. We had even a nominee to the Federal Reserve Board who had said that, you know, we should have used the pandemic to sort of drive all these fossil fuel extraction companies into bankruptcy. And yet, once again, I think despite their initial intentions, the Biden administration has ended up pursuing something much closer to an all-of-the-above strategy. We saw politically that when gasoline prices got very high over the summer, it wasn't sustainable politically. People hated it. Democrats were freaking out. We saw from the war between Russia and Ukraine that in the here and now, the global supply of natural gas is a question of crucial geopolitical importance. And so we've had this big move with Inflation Reduction Act to zero carbon energy in a technology neutral framework, but also to a significant abandonment of the idea that the United States is going to do without fossil fuels in the near term. So we're sort of back to all of the above, but the question is that a strategy that was adopted as a kind of brutal political reality? They had to make a deal with Joe Manchin, so you have to accept stuff that he demands, or is it really correct on the merits? I mean, do we have a strategy for a cleaner and more prosperous world that is very technology agnostic, or is it true that in some sense we have to come back to sort of stifling the fossil fuel industry directly? So we've got a great panel here to talk about these and other issues, and we are going to start off with Eliza.
Thanks, Matt. I'm Liza Reed. I'm with the Niskanen Center, and I'm the research manager for electricity transmission. So it will come as no surprise that I'm about to talk about electricity transmission and how that fits into this all of the above structure that Matt just talked about. I think one thing that's really important that you highlighted, but I want to underscore, is how much change has happened in a short period of time in the energy landscape of the United States. And one of those changes is just how much renewable energy we actually got on the grid, right? That a significant amount of renewable energy has been added to the grid, especially compared to sort of where we were 10, 15 years ago and what folks expected. And you're exactly right that there's this still requirement, right, for a balanced grid to work, that we still have some reliance on fossil fuel infrastructure. And in fact, there's no credible studies that I'm aware of that say we can get where we need to be with 100% wind, water, solar, right? That most decarbonization studies still find that we're going to need some dependence on clean firm, which is often code for natural gas with some sort of carbon capture, right? And so there's a bit of a reality challenge happening here, right? And how we get to the future we want and what we need to pass through to get there. But the other reality challenge is that we never achieved an all of the above approach, right? We're actually still trying to get to the all of the above approach, I would argue, because what we found when we started adding more renewable energy and trying to build more wind and solar farms is that we didn't have the infrastructure that could achieve an all of the above approach. And that's where we find that the all of the above is really, quite frankly, been a lie for the past 10 years, because we had regulatory barriers to getting electricity transmission that could unlock renewable energy in the way that natural gas pipelines have been able to unlock natural gas infrastructure. And I think it's not too hard, you don't even have to squint to see on the horizon that hydrogen and CO2 are going to be part of this picture as well, right? And they have ties to that same fossil infrastructure, right? How are we getting the hydrogen? CO2 is obviously, well, not always, it can be direct capture, it's not obviously always linked to a fossil fuel infrastructure, but there's still ties to that history of all of the above. And I really want to talk about transmission because it's a problem that we have today, and so I think it's helpful to talk about it and highlight what that means for linear infrastructure. We do not have any pathway for building transmission today that we need to reach any of our climate goals, to get any sort of real amount of renewable energy, right, to even get to 80%, let alone 100% onto the grid. We don't have a market pathway. Talk to Michael Skelly and the folks who have since bought the clean line assets that still have not been turned into transmission lines that are bringing wind power from the Great Plains over into load centers in the Midwest. Those have failed due to regulatory burdens. We don't have a regulated pathway. So utilities get together in groups called regional transmission organizations or independent system operators. Sort of doesn't matter how we define these, but the point is, even in the regulated system, with utilities getting together and agreeing in the mid-Atlantic market, utilities got together and agreed on a pair of lines connecting Pennsylvania and Maryland that was going to improve reliability and unlock economic opportunity for Maryland, and Pennsylvania said no, right? So now we have a regulated utility that can't get their lines built. And then we don't have a state-driven approach either. No matter what the Wall Street Journal opinion article says about how transmission is just going to let states pay for their clean energy on everyone else's backs, Massachusetts has been trying to bring clean energy into Massachusetts for, is it a decade now? I actually don't even know how long it's been, but they've had 2 failed attempts, and all of these have been blocked because of the very broken way that we regulate this linear transmission infrastructure. And so I think this is important to think about as we look into the future about what we need and really highlighting that we don't have an all-of-the-above approach because our existing system can move natural gas anywhere it needs to be around the country, right? And it cannot move electrons anywhere they need to be around the country. So we aren't even on equal footing yet, let alone have the capability to move on to sort of the next phase of clean only. And I want to pause here and shift a bit to talk about, you'd mentioned the costs, right? And what drives people to think differently about all of the above approach. Utilities have a requirement, electric utilities have a requirement to provide low-cost, reliable power. And one of the reasons that they are allowed this regulated monopoly is that's very difficult for a consumer to figure out, right? I have an electrical engineering degree, and I don't want to be figuring out how the electrons get to people's homes, right? I mean, that is a regulated utility's role, is to get it reliably and low cost. And so it's not reasonable that the consumer should have to figure that out, but what gets hidden in that is the choices that actually make that impossible, right? That there's nobody who does have the regulatory authority to unlock all of the low-cost energy that we have in the United States, right? To unlock the renewables in the Great Plains, the renewables in the Southwest, right? To share all this energy. There's nobody who has that regulatory authority. And in fact, explicitly, there are utilities who have competing interests, right? So there's this horrific story of a utility opposing a transmission line. And while the transmission line was in court, they built a natural gas plant where the transmission line was going to go so that now they could give their renewable energy, but that's not low cost anymore, right? That's not low cost in a high natural gas price world. And so folks see their energy bills going up and they see their gas bills going up, but they also see their electricity bills going up. Natural gas even gets a fuel pass-through. It just goes right onto our bills, right? Whereas electricity transmission always has to get negotiated at every dollar, and it becomes this physical avatar in both dollars and infrastructure for something people don't want, but it is sort of part of this all of the above that we really need to face and consider, right? I mean, I'm totally going to shift into the afternoon's discussion of build, right? That all of the above is about build. And so I think it's really important to take this moment, and we've had some really difficult times in the grid in the past 2 years that I think are also helpful to reflect on. There was extreme heat in California, and I think a lot of folks here maybe were living through that and being told you've got to demand response, you've got to turn down your heat, you've got to turn off your lights, whatever. Right? California was able to keep the lights on. Right? A year and a half ago, Texas had a cold snap where they were asking similarly for people to conserve energy, and more than 100 people died in Texas. And one of the differences is that California was able to import a lot of energy in order to meet that increasing demand. And California wasn't checking what color those electrons were when they were importing that energy, right? And Texas didn't have any capability. And these are two states that actually have quite a bit of renewables on their grid, right? Texas does have very high renewable energy, but wasn't able to import any more. And so that again goes back to like how this infrastructure keeps us from really being able to achieve what we're looking for. And so I think when we talk about all of the above, we really need to be forward-looking, and instead of backwards at what fossil fuels have had in the past sort of as a privilege, we need to be forward-looking and how do we build the infrastructure today knowing it's eventually going to be clean energy, right? All those electrons on transmission lines aren't necessarily going to be green. The hydrogen and the hydrogen pipelines, I don't know what rainbow it's going to be, right? I think gray's the bad one, and I think green's the good one, and there's like 6 colors in between, right? But some of it's going to have to be gray before we can get to all green hydrogen, and I think these are really important questions that we have to think about with all of the above.
Fantastic. Thank you, Arvind.
Great. Thanks for having me here. Arvind Ravikumar. I'm a faculty in the Petroleum Engineering Department at UT Austin. You know, I say this to a lot of people. You know, there's a lot of discussion on Twitter about being a liberal in a conservative county or a conservative in a very liberal county. Try being someone who advocates for strong climate policy in the Petroleum Engineering Department in the country. You'll know exactly how those people feel. You know, one of the things that, you know, I study supply chains, oil and gas supply chains specifically, and one of the things that I think about in terms of framing this problem around all of the above approach is that I think of it essentially as a risk management and resiliency challenge. You know, what we have seen over the past few years as our main problem is a problem of scarcity. We don't have enough oil. We don't have enough natural gas. We don't have enough electricity. And, you know, economists in the audience might eviscerate me for this, but I think the biggest problem is this scarcity has been brought on by our tendency to sacrifice resilience at the altar of economic efficiency, right? What we have done so far is optimize everything. Our supply chains work on a just-in-time basis. You order something in Amazon, someone packages it in a warehouse tomorrow. You want to power a natural gas power plant, the gas that goes into the power plant probably got produced maybe a day or 2 ago. Everything happens just in time, and it has to happen in a very ordered sequence. One of them breaks, the whole system crumbles. And that's what happened in 2021 in Texas when the electricity grid went offline because we couldn't get natural gas to the power plants. And the reason is, you know, this is the exact reason why I don't see this all of the above approach as a giveaway to the fossil fuel industry or a tactic to delay the energy transition. The way I think of this is building resiliency into the system, even as we figure out how to transition to a low-carbon economy over the next 10, 20, 30 years. And that's how I think about why we need a lot of all the fuels that we are talking about today. And you know, here's a story I'd like to tell, somewhat grim. During the Cold War, if you look at our natural gas infrastructure in the Northeast, a lot of the transmission pipelines and the compressors that move the natural gas, they're overbuilt in terms of capacity that was needed then. They built more compressors, they built larger capacity pipelines because of the fear that the Soviet Union would bomb some of them and they'll still have something left over if one of the compressors got taken out. So, and to this day, those compressors don't operate all the time. Every station you walk into, there might be 4 or 5 different units. At a time, only 2 or 3 are operating because they built resiliency into the system in the 1960s and 70s. And now, war is a terrible reason to build resiliency into anything, but that shows us the power of how having a little bit of slack in the system can actually help you when we're thinking about large-scale energy transitions. That's not the end of the story. I spend my research thinking about energy supply chain, specifically on oil and gas. And one of the things that's important is that the reason all of the above energy approach works right now is because we are in this moment where we are just taking baby steps towards decarbonization. Because one of the things that's different in oil and gas that's not the same as wind or solar is that it needs a vast network of infrastructure to actually work. For us to be able to use our gas burners in our home for cooking or heating, you need wells that produce oil and gas. You need processing plants and refineries that clean them up. You need pipelines and compressors that move the gas and oil to where we need to use them. And the thing that we need to be thinking about as we transition, as we lower demand for fossil fuels, as we grow our clean energy, is that who's going to maintain all of that as our demand for fossil fuel diminishes? Nobody's going to open or operate a coal mine to power 2 different coal plants. Nobody's going to open a refinery if demand is going down. And that's exactly what we're seeing in California. Marathon Oil is converting their Martinez refinery to produce biodiesel because gasoline demand in California is not growing. And the only thing they can do with that refinery is to produce biodiesel so they can get credits on the California low carbon fuels market. And all of the above approach works because we are just starting out, and we need to build resiliency into the system as we figure out how to do this well. But at the same time, we must be thinking about how do we wind this down, because this comes back to the point that Derek made yesterday. We don't know how to subtract. We don't know how to take large infrastructure that are connected offline as we move to completely new different systems, and that's something we need to be working on over the next 10, 20, 30 years. The second point I make, and sort of related to what Liza just mentioned, is that one of the criticisms of an all-of-the-above approach is that it permits continued fossil fuel use and gets companies that emit carbon off the hook. And I think that's a fair criticism because of the way how carbon accounting has worked over the past few decades. And I think that's going to be changing because of 2 big reasons. One is technology and innovation, and the second one is markets. One of the things that's been fascinating to me, we heard something about methane earlier. Technology has now allowed governments and public to know how much we are emitting without the cooperation of any of these fossil fuel companies. Just about 10 years ago, if you think about how did we know how much Exxon or Chevron or Shell is emitting, it's because the companies reported what they were emitting. To this day, EPA's greenhouse gas emissions inventories are built based on self-reported numbers submitted by these companies. That's a problem, and the critics are right. If that's how you're going to know what your carbon emissions are, of course, in all of the above approach, there's a hazard to expanding more carbon emissions in the atmosphere. But thankfully, that's changing. We have new technologies that allow us to better monitor carbon emissions. So we have satellites being launched every day by startups in this country where you can now just point your satellite at a facility and know what their carbon emissions are. The oil and gas companies are scared. In fact, you see many companies announcing the programs to monitor emissions, to measure emissions, to release public information, precisely because if they don't, someone like Environmental Defense Fund or one of you in this audience could pay a couple $1,000 to a satellite company and point at their facility and see what they're emitting. That's a huge PR problem that they cannot come out of. At the same time, Obama's approach to sort of open up U.S. oil and gas to exports is becoming very useful to promote climate policy in this case. The U.S. has become the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas in the world. And what has that done is to expose U.S. producers to climate policy around the world, climate policy in Europe, climate policy in Asia, who arguably were far ahead of us until recently. What that means is Europe is demanding that the LNG exporter in the US show that they have low methane emissions and low carbon emissions along their supply chain. And what that's doing is US exporters are now demanding from oil and gas producers that they reduce their emissions. And they can demand that because Cheniere, one company that exports LNG, buys more US natural gas than the production of ExxonMobil and Chevron and ConocoPhillips combined. They have such market power that if Cheniere comes out and says, you need to reduce your methane emissions or we're going to some other supplier, companies will do it. And so 2 things, the technology and the market aspects of this are going to make sure that we hold the fossil fuels companies' feet to their fire and make sure that they don't expand their emissions, even as we think about how all of the different fuels can help us towards this energy transition.
All right, thank you. Arnav.
Thank you, and thanks to Breakthrough for this great event, and Alex and Thea for everything. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about myself first and my organization. I work for an organization called Employ America, where we advocate for a full employment economy. A better part of the last 9 to 12 months of my life has been about convincing the Biden administration to boost domestic oil production. You might be asking yourself, why? What's the connection here between full employment and oil production? And I'd kind of just say a couple things to that. For one thing, gas prices are really bad, and they really sap a lot of the energy that we have for a full employment economy. Even though the Fed is theoretically not considering oil and energy prices when it is making interest rate decisions, we know that in a high inflation environment, if energy and oil prices are contributing quite a bit to that, for one thing, they have direct pass-through effects, which can be meaningful, but also they just create a lot of pressure on the Fed to raise interest rates. And so to the extent that we can use administrative authority to limit that pressure, we want to do it. And so I'd kind of argue that a full employment economy is quite vulnerable to the volatility in the energy market. And so in oil particularly, over the last couple of decades, we've seen what a lot of people call the super cycle. They peak at around 120, 130, 140, and then they drop significantly over a couple of years. And what happens is at the high end, consumers are hurt really hard and politicians are punished. And at the low end, you see investment drop off, which sets us up for the next steep hike in prices. But also, it makes the price of alternatives and electric vehicles less economic relatively. And so to the extent that we as the United States, as the world's largest producer of oil now, and also with considerable available storage capacity at the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, to the extent that we can use our authority to limit that volatility, we make ourselves less vulnerable, and we make a full employment economy less vulnerable to those energy disruptions. And so our idea that we've been really pushing for over the last couple of months is to give oil producers price insurance, basically to guarantee their demand that is necessary to justify investment in new production. And particularly with the tail risks looming from the war in Ukraine and Russian production falling off, but also more demand in China coming online, we believe that the US can actually really fill a lot of that gap, and the margins that you're working with are meaningful enough that we can reduce that price volatility. And so I think over the course of this advocacy, there's a couple things I've learned about what we need to really deregulate abundance and support and all of the above energy approach. And the first thing I would say is we need agencies and institutions with the right authorities to actually support an abundance approach. And what do those look like? I'll take from Derek's talk last night and some stuff that Matt's written about is we need authority to support new invention. What does that look like? It looks like authorities to engage in things like advanced market commitments, purchase guarantees for new technology. Every agency should have Operation Warp Speed type authority to be putting 15 or 20 or 1,500 Operation Warp Speed type projects for new technologies that we need to get us through to decarbonize. And then also to take from Derek last night, we need to be supporting production, and we need the authorities that will support production. I'll bring a very specific example from our SPR advocacy. When the SPR acquires crude oil, it uses something called a market index-based contract. And so what that means is when crude is delivered to the SPR, it is priced at whatever the market index price for oil for West Texas is at that time, based on the West Texas intermediate price. And there's some good reasons for that. It limits, it's more economically efficient, to get to Arvin's point, for the DOE. One thing it doesn't do is it doesn't give producers any guarantee of where their price is going to be when they deliver it. So it really has no impact on their decision-making from an investment standpoint long term. The Biden administration recently proposed a new rule to drop that requirement. And it would be really groundbreaking because they could engage in things like forward contracts or the sale of put options, which would give producers the price insurance necessary to justify a new investment. And so that's the type of contract authority I'm talking about when I'm talking about how do you actually support production. And then I think the other big thing I would say is even with all the right legal authorities, you still need the political will to do it. And when prices are really high, I work with a lot of Hill offices and a lot of people in the administration. Even the most progressive of progressives were, drill baby drill type activists. I was just shocked at how quickly it had turned. But now that prices have receded, that energy and enthusiasm for kind of supporting more oil production has fallen. And I think we need to kind of get past some of the dogmas of oil profits and profits for oil companies are bad inherently, and so we shouldn't be supporting them. If we could trade a little bit of profit for oil companies for price stability between $70 and $80 a barrel, I'd say that's a worthwhile trade, and it's a worthwhile trade in the context of decarbonization as an industrial policy project. And I think convincing political leadership to use these authorities is really important. I'll just kind of finish with a little story about when NASA was first created, one of the key drafters who later became NASA's first general counsel, he invented something called Other Transaction Authority. What is that? It's literally other transaction authority, as in other than whatever other transactions are allowed in this statute. And it basically lets you design any type of contract you want to meet any contingency. That's actually what the NASA General Counsel said later, was that we knew we needed incredible collaboration between private industry and government and institutions and think tanks and all these different things. We needed the authority to meet any contingency. And a lot of agencies, 11 agencies have OTA now, but they don't use them equally. Between 2010 and 2014, NASA used their OTA 13,000 times, including with SpaceX. This is one of the authorities that really promoted the development of SpaceX. The Department of Energy and ARPA-E together used it 36 times. So this is just an example of, even if you have that authority, you need to be willing to take the risk to use it. And so I'll finish there and say, and as the lawyer on the panel, the resident lawyer on the panel, let's get the right legal authorities and let's make sure we use them.
Thank you, thank you. I think the point you made in there about the waxing and waning interest in this question with the ups and downs of gasoline prices is just really important. And I think that, if there's one thing I could convince the more progressive members of Congress is that they need to remember what their own reaction was when gasoline prices were really high, right? It's not like me or Alex or any bad eco-modernists who were freaking out about that. It's they themselves, nobody was up there saying, oh, this is good. It's good that gasoline is heading up to $5 a gallon because that's helping us meet our carbon targets, right? And so if the left is not willing to say that that's good, they need to act like that's what they believe all the time and create resilience against the recurrence of that scenario. But Liza, I wanted to come back to you and I didn't understand transmission at all until you explained it to me last year. And I think on a basic level, right, what you're saying is that all of the above is not genuinely neutral if we're just looking at the production of energy, because there's two different systems for how does the energy get to somewhere, and can you just spell it out? What are those systems? What do people need to know?
It's funny. Thank you for giving me credit for explaining transmission, because I actually read some of the pieces you wrote afterwards, and now that's what I share with people. It's oh, Matt does a very good job
working together.
This makes sense. So, mutual fan club here. Coal moves around on railroads. Mm-hmm. Natural gas moves around on pipelines. There are I don't remember the number, I'm going to make one up. It's over 100,000. I think it's 400,000 miles. But there's a couple 100,000 miles of natural gas transmission lines in the United States, right? And that's what, and Arvind was talking about this, right? That's how we move natural gas around the country. Transmission lines are painfully more complex than that, right? Because there's physics that matters in how transmission lines work, and I'm going to spare you the physics because I don't really know the physics either. But, but what matters is that we have a lot of what are essentially smaller transmission lines, right? Because that's historically what we've needed, because we didn't need to move electricity far, right? It was actually very difficult. It's so interesting, going back to what Arnab was saying about innovation, right? And how much the technology of transmission has changed, right? So over 100 years ago, when we were starting with electricity transmission, we were moving at like a couple of miles, right? That's all you could
You build the power plant close to where you need
exactly. You build a power plant close to where you need the power, and then you move the fuel to it, right? And now we're in a different mindset, right, where we need to go where the fuel is, right? We need to go where the wind is. We need to go where the solar is. And before anybody in the climate academic space gets mad at me, there's lots of places in the United States where solar is cost effective. It is not just the Southwest. There are lots of places now. But when you need to get the mass that you need, right, the amount of energy that you need, the amount of power that you need, you still need to go a bit where the power is. And so now you need to move the electrons, right? So we're moving electrons, and that's where the physics gets really messy. And the best way to move electrons is the electricity transmission equivalent of a big pipe, right? You need the big lines.
Yeah.
Those unfortunately come with very big towers, right? And that's one of the ways that you get into trouble. But that's the key, right? About what has shifted is that we need to shift how we think about electricity. We need to go to where the power is. But then also, and I brought up Texas and California because we actually do need to depend on each other more, right? It's sort of an essential truth that if you try to build everything to work individually, it's going to be more expensive than if you can create shared services. And electricity transmission can and should be more of a shared service, right? But that runs into incumbent issues, right? And what it means to give market access, because that drives down my assets, right? And so you just have a lot of conflicting issues there.
Well, and so Arvind, I mean, you were talking about resilience, right, versus sort of narrow efficiency. And I mean, what is the kind of economic case, right? I mean, people have to bear costs to have excess capacity, but there's real value to that. It's obviously incredibly annoying if the power goes out, it can be deadly. So, I mean, what do we need to do to create a structure where it's worth somebody's while to bear those costs?
Right. That's a great question, because that's one of my pet peeves about how we talk about cost effectiveness and resiliency, because we only talk about one side of that story. We don't talk about what happens if we are not resilient. I'll give an example of what happened in Texas in February 2021 when the cold snap came over all of Texas, and then we had snow for the first time in Austin. What happened was, there was big blackouts. That was the news. What's not in the news now is that every single user, every single household in Texas is paying for that, and they will continue to pay for it for the next 25 years. The reason is the electricity companies that paid hundreds and thousands of dollars to get very scarce gas during the blackout time, they ended up getting billions of dollars in debt. So the way you pay for debt in the utility system, and I'm not a lawyer, but I know my bill comes out and I see what the charges are, they get spread out to every single consumer in the state. And so whatever, $10 billion, $12 billion gets spread out across every consumer. I'm paying about, I think, $14 extra every month. I'll be paying that for the next 20 years. That is the cost of not being resilient. And we don't talk about that. We talk about, why do we need to have an additional power plant? Why do we need to have an additional pipeline? Because if you don't, you're going to be paying extra $14 in your power bills for the next 20 years. And that's billions of dollars that could have been avoided.
And I think it's important, from a pure ecological point of view to understand that there's a cost to environmental goals to a lack of real resilience. My in-laws in Texas, they got a wood-burning stove after losing power there, because people don't want to be cold in the winter, right?
Right.
And they're going to find a way to try to heat their homes. And in this case, moving to the dirtiest form of energy. Imagine sighting wood on fire. It's like that's terrible, right? And we can do better than that. And if you, in the name of a kind of fastidiousness, push people to the extremes, bad stuff kind of happens. And Arnhem, I mean, resilience really is also what you're talking about with the SPR, but more in a market sense, right? The resilience to the kind of prices. And what do you think is the resistance to thinking in those terms? Is it just about profits for oil companies?
I think that's part of it. That certainly animates parts of at least the Democratic coalition that is in power now. I think there is also, I think the most common criticism, pushback we've heard when we've been advocating for this is, the SPR is a drop in the bucket, right? Where, Biden's releasing 1 million barrels a day, like what difference does that make in a market of, 80 billion barrels produced, 80 million, sorry, 80 billion would be great. 80 million produced per day, and the reality is that's just kind of a misunderstanding about what drives these prices. They're really driven by the imbalance between supply and demand globally. And that number only really, at extremes, it's maybe at the beginning of COVID, the glut was around 4 million, but even at its most extreme, it rarely goes above 2. And in high price environments, it's been around 1 or even slightly below. And if you think about those numbers, the SPR actually has quite a bit of power. You could pull off, it has the capacity to take 400,000 barrels per day in delivery. And so if you're in a glut environment where there's excess supply of 1 million barrels, taking off 400,000 would actually have considerable price impacts. And additionally, if the administration were to announce a put options facility, as we've been calling for, employamerica.org, they could essentially incent the production of about 1 million new net barrels of oil. And that's considerable in the context of that supply-demand imbalance.
And I think this, imbalance question, right, it's relevant across the board. I mean, I'm a little new to the climate and energy industry topic, right, but I did, boring economic stuff. And something I think a lot of people don't get intuitively is that the prices are set at the margin. So even if you have, if you're close to abundance, but you're falling short, and the grid shuts down unless you match supply and demand, that last bit determines your final price to the consumer. And I think this is relevant to transmission questions as well, because it's like the more pathways between the nodes you have, right, the less likely you are to get in some kind of hard squeeze.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And Arvind gave the great example from Texas, right? And when they're trying to import, they were trying to get natural gas, but also electricity, right? They needed any kind of electricity they would have taken. They just didn't have the capacity. On the flip side, when you have oversupply because of lack of transmission, right? You've got the Great Plains, who has had, SPP is the term, Southwest Power Pool is the term for this group of utilities sort of down the Great Plains. And Bloomberg just had a really interesting report that SPP has had more negative energy prices than any other region in the United States, because they have all this wind and they cannot get it to who needs to buy the wind. And negative energy prices are very bad for anybody in the region who is making energy, right? It's not a good thing to have negative energy prices.
Right, and just, like, not that many people live on the plain.
Right.
It's very windy. But, and we presumably we want to see investment in that area, right? Like, they continue to have like empty space there where you could put turbines up, but people need an assurance that they'll be able to sell that to someone. So, in terms of resiliency, I mean, does bringing more renewables into the mix, right? How does that kind of impact the reliability of the remaining fossil fuel sector? I mean, you were talking about the refineries puzzle, but this, it strikes me as a kind of a harder problem than most people realize.
Right, I think that's a great question. And one of the things we should realize here is that oil and natural gas are very different beasts. I mean, we tend to talk about oil and gas industry as one big monolith, but it's really not. And an example of where this matters is exactly what Matt pointed out. When you think of natural gas, as we have more and more renewable energy come online, demand in the power sector for natural gas is going to go down quickly. But what we are seeing right now is that our exports of natural gas are increasing much faster than we can actually bring down demand. And so my argument has been that, we have to make progress on climate change. We have to reduce carbon emissions, not just in the US, but globally. And in the US, we have the economic power and the tools to be able to rapidly reduce emissions in the power sector. I say just take natural gas out of the power sector entirely, or at least have a little bit for your resiliency, but use that natural gas to send it to other countries that are using more carbon-intensive fuels. And that's a part of how we are going to shift. We have to start somewhere. Yes, power sector is going down. The Inflation Reduction Act is going to expand renewables. The natural gas demand is going to go down. Okay, where's our natural gas? Could be the best use in the world. And I think that's how we have to be seeing how we make up for this transition. Oil is a very different beast. It's going to become much more challenging. I mean, the refinery problem is just starting. It's going to become a global problem. And the reason is, electric vehicles are becoming sort of cost parity with internal combustion engine vehicles in the US. Over the next 5 years, given all the new manufacturing that's coming online, it's going to go much cheaper. And so what you're going to see happen is demand for motor gasoline, the one that we use in our cars, is going to go down. But that's not how oil works. Crude oil, when it goes to a refinery, you get like 10 different products, out of which motor gasoline is just one of them. And these refineries in the US are very unique facilities. They are not 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000. They are each individually built to process the crude they are getting. And so when you remove one product, when you remove demand for one product, what the hell are the refineries going to do? Because now their crude is completely out of balance because they don't have one of the products. There's no demand for one of the products that come out of it. And so that's going to be a much broader challenge. I think that's where we need to be putting our efforts into thinking about, as we reduce demand for oil going into the future, how are we going to manage the existing demand until we reach a point where we won't need the infrastructure that's already in place?
And this is, I think, part of the sort of the SPR project, right, which was traditionally, created for a sort of a national security purpose, that we needed the physical command. But we're now faced with a world in which, oil is becoming less important with each passing year. Investors can see that that's the case, and they worry about long-range investments, but it's still incredibly important, right? If we eliminated half of the internal combustion engine car fleet in the United States, that would still be a lot of gasoline-powered cars, and what happens to those prices is going to matter a lot economically, and so we're thinking about like a long-term project of managing decline.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think how we kind of I think how we think about the type of infrastructure we need to build that, to support that, to manage that decline is really important. And the one thing we keep coming back to, and in the context of the SPR, is, as you said, historically it was really about the value from the SPR came from the oil that was in storage, right? We have 700, 600, whatever the number is, barrels in storage to meet a severe energy crisis. Now we really need to think about it as the true asset is the available storage. The fact that it's been depleted actually gives us more power to pull crude oil off the market so that we can manage that decline but keep producers producing. And oil's certainly, to the extent that like motor gasoline consumption is going down, we want to manage that, and we'll see that demand go down. But oil's not really going away, I think, from plastic processes and other industrial production that it's needed for. And so to the extent that those remain important and an important part of economy, we need to make sure that the investment is at least keeping, and supply is keeping consistent enough that those prices don't explode.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, I think one thing that it's worth kind of acknowledging here as we talk about all of the above is that, when I kind of first heard that phrase 15, 20 years ago, a big item, a big component of all of the above was coal, which is a major source of energy. I think that now the conversation is a little changed because not that coal doesn't exist or that coal isn't used, but that coal is going out on the economics. So you were talking about doing the, gas in a global context and doing the carbon accounting. And I think it's important to sort of, for Americans to think critically about, are we talking about a domestic or an international emissions impact when we talk about these different kinds of infrastructure? And can you sort of explain, what difference does that make?
Right. I'll get started on that, and then others can chime in. One of the key aspects that I think about is sort of the equity impacts of climate policy, not just in the US, but especially around the world. There are places in the world where increasing fossil fuels can actually lead to better outcomes. I get this famous example of how a lot of progress recently have been made in giving clean cook stoves to rural communities in India. They've been using traditional biomass or wood to cook, and that includes a lot of smoke, particulate matter pollution that resulted in diverse health impacts, in health impacts for women and children. So the government of India has a program to provide liquefied petroleum gas, which is a clean cook stove, to all of these communities for the past number of years, and that has been hugely successful in improving health impacts, in providing sort of free time for women and children to expand their educational and income-generating activities. And so there's a really good reason to think about this from a global perspective and not just the US perspective. And one of the things, when you bring up the topic of coal communities, one of the things we desperately failed is to plan for what coal communities would be like after the transition. I mean, right now coal is on an inexorable decline, and every single coal community is suffering because we didn't plan for it. We just let it happen. We let it rip through those communities, and now we are looking at the impacts of all of that, and we cannot let that happen for oil and gas. So even as we have to invest in making sure that the decline itself, the reduction in oil and gas use is managed, we have to make sure that we have plans for these communities. And to make plans for these communities, you have to actually go talk to them. Like, as part of my research, we do a lot of field work. I go to the smallest towns in Pennsylvania, in Texas, in North Dakota, in Wyoming, and the first thing you notice is that these communities are very, very, very different. Mm-hmm. Pennsylvania has a rich history of oil and gas. The gas wells in Pennsylvania, once you drill them, they produce gas for decades because they're all very, very deep wells. And so there are communities built around those facilities. There are grandchildren and children that are living in the same community, in the same town for generations. It is not the case in a place like the Permian Basin in Texas, because the wells that produce gas operate for maybe 3 years, maybe 5, and then the company will move on to a different well. And so those are transient communities. The needs of those transient communities in the energy transition will be very different from the needs of the communities in Pennsylvania. And we don't recognize that because we just talk about oil and gas industry as this one big thing, and there's huge differences between communities, even between companies, on how we deal with this going forward.
So, I mean, speaking of local communities, Liza, I mean, this seems like it's an issue in transmission. I don't really understand the physics of this, but for some reason, the long-range transmission towers, they're way bigger than the regular ones, right? I mean, you see them, like they're gigantic, and people decide that's bad for the landscape, or in the case of Massachusetts, right, they're trying to build long-range transmission from Quebec, and you gotta cut a swath through the forest, basically.
It's a tiny swath. It was a very tiny
It's a small,
swath.
yes. I mean, it is, I was all for it, but it's not nothing, right, as a construction project. And the nature of transmission, the whole point is that it's going past where you are to give power to somebody else. So how do we square that? Why would you accept any inconvenience or loss of your nice trees for the sake of electricity that's going to the next state over?
Yeah, so first, I don't want to lose the opportunity for transmission to be part of the global discussion as well, and so I do want to be clear that I support a global macro grid.
There we go.
So that we can build transmission everywhere, spanning the ocean. But no, it is much more of a local discussion, right, than we think about international markets. And God, how to answer this question? This is one of the big challenges about transmission lines broadly, is that the physics does matter, because a transmission line going past you does bring you value, right? It doesn't bring people to the lunch table, right? It doesn't bring people to restaurants, right? It doesn't like build the economy in that sense. But it brings reliability and resilience in ways that really matter, but are very hard to measure. And there was a really interesting debate that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and the National Association of Regulated Utility Commissions, FERC and NARUC, had a task force discussion back in, they had one in February and one in July, but in February they were talking about interregional transmission and how you figure out these benefits. And basically one of the arguments was we have to build it so that we can measure the benefits. And that's really one of the challenges, right? Because it isn't that same kind of simple economics of like increasing jobs in a region, right? But building a transmission line, initially, maybe you don't like what it looks like, right? But that power is impacting your grid, like it just is, right? You just have to believe me, right?
Well, no, but so it becomes a question of at what level of authority are we talking, right? Because if you talk in a national conversation, a national grid with a lot of interregional transmission will have a lot more reliability, and that will have benefits to everybody, versus if we're talking like at the town zoning board, and someone's like, that thing's too tall.
Yeah, right. And you know, we even saw this in Missouri. Missouri passed a law to sort of change the way eminent domain is used for transmission lines using HVDC, and they said that the amount of energy that comes off the line in Missouri has to be equivalent to the proportion of physical line miles that go through Missouri, right? And I think the other thing that makes this really challenging is that our goal, one of our goals with transmission is to increase market access, right? And so you're not following the electron on the transmission line either, right? This is one of the things that makes this job really hard, is that transmission doesn't work the same way as these other commodities, right? Because of how we move electricity. And so those benefits, I think we just need to think differently about how we talk to people about those benefits. And we were talking about this over breakfast too, right? That some of the arguments for transmission lines are cleaner air and cleaner energy, right? But we don't have a dollar on clean air right now, right? And so we can't see those economic benefits, but we can see the market benefit, and I think it's important to be talking about that more seriously, right? That this transmission line that you see isn't technically dropping off power in your community, but it is bringing wind power that is, you don't have a fuel pass-through, right? You don't have to pay for natural gas on your electricity bill. You are now having access to clean energy, right? There are explicit economic benefits, and Lawrence Berkeley National Lab just put out a really interesting study on this, like showing the explicit market value benefits of transmission, which is sort of one of the first studies that has said, like, let's exclusively put dollars and cents on something instead of sort of broader benefits, and you still see that we need nation-spanning.
Absolutely. So it looks like we're getting the transmission infrastructure for question asking built out here. So I think we'll open it up for that.
We've got a couple mics, myself and Ted over there. What we like to do here, if you've been to a breakthrough event before, is we like to take 2 or 3 questions at once and then allow the panel to sort of pick and choose what they feel prepared to respond to. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and Ted and I can run a mic to you.
Let's set the tone for the day with like real questions, not more of a comment, you know.
I was hoping we could start with like a 3 to 4 minute, very long, multi-point statement without a question. That's what we're really looking for here.
That's the dream.
Did you raise your hand? Didn't. Oh, okay. Well, I'm not gonna.
I think we got.
Over here, we got some over here.
Good morning. My name is Guido Núñez, Senior Data Scientist at Breakthrough Institute. I have a question whether the introduction of small nuclear changes the equation on long transmission lines.
Let's go one more.
If transmission were not an issue and we could solve it, what percentage of the U.S. grid could be renewables?
One more.
The third, or are they all transmission?
Hi, Andrew Harlan, Fusion Industry Association. Question about, again, transmission. I guess that's the hot topic.
Whew, let me stretch, guys, let me stretch.
I'm actually kind of surprised that we didn't talk about any technological solutions here. And so the incoming high-temperature superconducting wires allow you to have lossless electricity transmission that really you could just do it along existing rights of way, and you know, as our member companies, fusion companies, drive down the cost of HTS wire, it allows kind of this new technology pathway. What sort of other technology pathways are there to deal with the regulatory issues? So like, can we technology our way out of this? I think appropriate for Breakthrough Institute.
Thanks. Let's tackle those, and then we'll do another round after we hear.
That's
from...
all me, right? Okay.
I'm going to head up.
I'm going to punt on the first one, largely because I am not a nuclear expert, right? And so I think I will say what I say about any smaller local power versus transmission is that there's a cost and deployment issue, right, that transmission helps alleviate, right, as transmission helps us share power. And so I think there's incredible potential for these smaller modular nuclear reactors, which I wasn't taking notes soon enough to make sure I was using the right phrases, but I think there's an incredible opportunity here. I support it, I'm for it, I think there's resilience there, I think there's cost opportunity there, but we literally can build transmission now, and we need that transmission to share power, and even when we do, if and when we do have those more local nuclear solutions, there's still a resilience benefit to being able to share power with your neighbor, right? Like transmission could become the fire station in that case. It's a terrible metaphor. I keep trying to land the fire station metaphor, and it literally never works, and we're just retiring it today. Second question was about how much renewable energy we could get on the grid if we could solve the transmission problem. So in 2016, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration put a study together that was published in Nature Climate Change that found that the least cost path to 80% renewables on the grid was a nation-spanning high-voltage direct current transmission system. Right, so that was 80% in 2016 with the technology we had then. I actually don't know at the end of the day what the Princeton numbers are. I mean, I feel like that's the most recent. Do we have a Princeton net zero person in the room or online? Can they put in the chat what the percentage is? But it's very high renewable. But again, it doesn't get us to 100%, right? Which I think is important, that we need these clean firm, and whether that's, I know we've got some geothermal folks in the room, right? Like the different directions we can get there. But certainly incredibly far, right? We can get incredible penetration of clean energy if we can unlock the transmission problem. The third question was about technology. Love a high temperature superconductor. I think it's an incredible opportunity. My understanding of the state of that technology is that we're not even at a demonstration, right? We're sort of leading up to a potential small, like a couple mile maybe demonstration of the technology. Yeah, that sounds right. That sounds like the order of things, right? Flexible alternating current transmission systems, heavily deployed in Europe, still working on it here. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, I think there's a great opportunity for high temperature superconductors. I think there's still, you know, there's a part of the regulatory barrier that in theory you can overcome. But you still have this issue, right? You've got a new technology for moving a lot of capacity a long way. Right? But you still have all these regulatory barriers where you have to pay for it, and you need everyone along the way to agree, right, in our current system. Right? So there's tremendous opportunity for what it can do for the big towers, right, that we don't necessarily have the same giant towers, because to the physics, you're running a lot of current but not a lot of voltage.
Right.
So you don't need to be as tall, because the voltage is what increases the height of the tower, but the current you don't have.
The ability to make a decision that encompasses broad benefits rather than narrow benefits to the sort of intermediary standpoints, that's still...
It's still there, right. And getting everyone to agree in the absence of a federal authority is still there. In terms of other technologies, though, which I think was actually the intention of your question, high voltage direct current is one that I love to talk about, right? We have that NOAA study that I mentioned from 2016 used sort of the dominant technology at the time, which is sort of very clunky and cumbersome and hard to integrate with the alternating current system that dominates the US today. But there was a technology first demonstrated at high voltage in, recently, It was some recent year. It was in the last decade, and I can't remember it off the top of my head. But it's a new technology for still using this high voltage direct current idea. It's just the power electronics are different, right? And we don't need to get into that because I'm not a semiconductor expert either. But that's a major change in how we can think about two different electricity transmission systems working together. Like previously, our model of HVDC was that it had to be functionally different than AC. Like they don't interact well with the old technology. This new technology allows them to integrate more. And so you can think about putting DC lines in lots more places, right? You used to only be able to think about putting a DC line essentially from hydropower into load because it was isolated. The new technology means you don't have to isolate it, which means you can put more lines between different regions, right? You can put more lines into Texas, for example. You can build lines to get that wind power out of SPP. All of these still have that physics systems problem of more power into nodes, right? And so this brings us back to reliability and resilience. That when we think about reliability, the way that the North American Electric Reliability Council, NERC, thinks about reliability is if a line goes down, right? It's called N-1, N-2, right? If these lines go down, what can we still do? So there's this interesting tension. If we increase the power that we can send in a single line, what does that mean about reliability and resilience if now that power goes out, right? So there's a lot of issues at play here, but I think the way we manage topology on the grid is incredibly important, and I think that question's really good for like how we measure and sense and move power. There's a lot of developing technologies that are going to be crucial.
Should we get another batch here?
Can I just add one thing to
Please.
just to the technology deployment thing? I think one thing that's really difficult, this won't solve all of the problems, but particularly for a lot of the small startups that are involved in this, we can't really use federal procurement power to provide demand for that. The reason for that is there's something called the Federal Acquisition Regulation, which I was recently in Turkey, and so I was reading a lot about the Byzantine Empire, and the FAR makes the Byzantine Empire look like, I don't know, the Estonian government or something like that. Like it's so onerous, and so it rewards companies that have big compliance budgets. And so to the extent that we can utilize some of the other authorities I've talked about to promote procurement, which is what we did with the semiconductor industry, right? So in the 50s and 60s, we were basically purchasing semiconductors at every part of the edge, at the leading edge and the lagging edge, and I think at one point we were providing purchase guarantees for 70% of all semiconductors that were being produced, and what that did is it pushed that frontier forward and forward and forward. We can't really do that through traditional procurement because the FAR is so onerous, and so to the extent that we can use procurement and some of these other authorities more creatively to support technological development and acceleration, I think that's a pretty critical thing we should be doing.
Questions?
In the vein of what Ted and Alex raised yesterday about what can we subtract to build, what would you subtract to allow more efficient and quicker build out of the transmission you all have been sharing that we need?
A couple more.
Hey, Richard. Thanks, Richard Morrison with CEI. This question is sort of for Arvind, I guess. When we see long-term declining demand for oil and gas, and you mentioned there's all these communities that depend on that, you mentioned a lot of products already come out of crude oil, not just gasoline. What's the prospect for more non-combustible material science uses for the stuff that's in oil and gas, including like plastics? Can we have a plastics renaissance that uses all that oil without burning it?
Jordan McGillis, Manhattan Institute. Arvind, you have alluded today about the importance of increasing access to oil and gas products for the developing world, and it reminded me of a really interesting piece you wrote a year or two back for the MIT Technology Review on carbon border taxes. Can you expound on that?
Sure. I should have taken notes for these questions. So let me go back to your question on demand for oil and gas products that are non-combustible. I think you hit the nail on the head, because the problem we have is the carbon emissions. Everything else, like if you can solve the carbon problem, we can solve everything else. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about in terms of how do we help communities manage this transition, yes, material science is a huge field. There's a lot of people working on thinking about pyrolysis of natural gas. So you just split the carbon and the hydrogen atoms of methane so that there's no CO2 being generated. There's a lot of cool research going on that way. But I think there are also uses and applications that we know how to do. For example, in many of these communities, the Department of Energy right now is investing to set up hydrogen hubs around the country. And you can develop hydrogen out of natural gas that you build using pyrolysis, which does not release carbon emissions. And so one of the things we have been thinking about is which communities are most suited for hydrogen. And then you can think about which communities are most suited for geothermal, depending on the demographic of the community, their history with oil and gas operators. And the advantage is many of the new industries in the clean energy economy, whether it's hydrogen, whether it's geothermal, are all things that the oil and gas industry are already poised to do. Like many companies are investing in them, many companies are talking about them, and so it would be a retraining program rather than just starting a new industry from scratch. So there's a lot of potential if we plan for it and if we think about it more carefully on how do we help these communities continue to have economic development in the region, but at the same time develop products that do not emit CO2. And there are already solutions for that. We have to make sure that the people in these communities make those decisions on what technologies they would like to see in their communities, as well as the federal government bringing in support in terms of finances. I mean, one of the biggest problems right now is a lot of these local communities are run because of tax revenues from oil and gas production, from royalty revenue, from property taxes. And once oil and gas production starts declining, those things will decline. The federal government has to backfill that. Not forever, but until the point at which new industries start developing those communities. But that's really important to make sure that they don't end up in the same fate as some of our coal communities have in the recent past.
So Marcella's question, this was an issue, I was thinking about listening to Derek last night, because I feel like we both need to sort of change the regulation to allow for transmission, but is it really a problem where you could delete something and unlock it, or do we actually need to build something that makes
like
this
something
possible?
Completely new? Like you want to...
As a structure, right? Because there's not a rule somewhere that's no, you can't build a transmission line and we can just get rid of it. It's that they're really long, right? They have to go across a lot of states and a lot of different people's property, and there has to be a system.
Right. So, and I think it's important to understand what one of the things that's blocking transmission lines is there's a property impact, but public utility commissions condemn people's property all the time. Right? They love to, right? So when that is used to stop a transmission line, the Public Utility Commission is acting for other reasons, right? It is not the fear of condemning that property, right? And I think this is a perfect question because it's been 1 week since we lost the permitting bill, right? That Senator Manchin had proposed, and that includes the deletion to how we think about transmission, right? So the way that electricity transmission in the current law is permitted in the United States is that states get a first crack. So if you have a high capacity interstate line, which is Independence Energy Connect, it's those clean line projects I mentioned, right? It's all of these, it's actually not technically the main line. You have to go to each state and get each state to agree that this transmission line provides enough benefits to the state. If the states don't agree, and the Department of Energy has previously done a study that says here is a place we need transmission, then the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission can come in and say, you should cite this line. That's a lot of steps, right? You can delete some of those steps, and you don't have to delete them everywhere. Right? We know, and one of the things that Senator Manchin's bill proposed is deleting that state process, and not everywhere, right? It wasn't saying get rid of state commissions. It says, let the Department of Energy do an analysis that says where we need transmission, right? Or look at a transmission and decide, oh yes, this has sort of broader than state impacts, and directly cite it, right? Like, we don't have to play this game where like, well, we'll give you a chance, but then ultimately we're going to make the decision we were going to make anyway, right? Just make the decision you were going to make, right? That's a deletion. You could go even further, and I would say you should go even further. And there's some things you don't need a study for. High capacity, interstate lines. Every single study shows that that provides broader impacts than a single state can capture. So high capacity, interstate, cut out state regulators, cut out Department of Energy, go direct to the Federal Regulatory Commission, right? So there's many steps that we can cut out in this process without having to create something completely new.
Fantastic. And I think we're out of time. So thank you all for your insights. Thank you for your questions.